Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first webinar of this new initiative between ESX School of Management in France and the Association of Key Account Managers, an association dedicated towards professionalizing the key account management practice. In our first webinar, we have the privilege of working with a practitioner turned academic. We have Professor Sylvie Lacoste from Excelia Business School in France as well. And today, Professor Lacoste is going to share her insights into a paper which is titled Lateral Collaboration and Boundary Spanning from a Global Leadership Perspective, the Case of Global Account Managers. This is a paper that is hot off the press. That is something that she has worked with one of her students. And again, a wonderful example of how to work together with young students and get academic publications on highly relevant managerial topics. So Professor Lacoste and Sylvie, if you don't mind, thank you so much for being the first person to work on this new initiative.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure too.
Sylvie, tell me a little bit more about this project. I love this idea of lateral collaboration and boundary spanning. So how did you come about with this idea?
Okay, the first idea was not about lateral collaboration and boundary spanning. It was more about the concept of leadership related to global account managers.
Got it.
As you've said, I've been a global account manager in my career. And one of the hurdles is that you may have a very large teams. I think I was working with about 30 local or regional account managers, but they did not depend on me. Their boss was in their country. So I was working with a Brazilian key account manager, but his boss was the head of Brazil. Yeah. And that made the whole job sometimes a bit difficult. So my first idea is how do you overcome those hurdles of not having to work with a very large team? None of them is really your team. And you have to show some leadership because still they are your team. And we are all working with the same customer.
Absolutely. And that's a very interesting point that you raised, right? Because if nobody takes leadership, it is the customer who's going to suffer, right? Because at the end of the day, that is always the problem in many matrix organizations, is usually we say your global account managers should not be what we call toothless tigers. They look like a tiger, they have a title, but unfortunately they cannot do a lot of things because of the way a matrix organization is structured. I think in terms of maintaining that relationship with your customers and doing that, and I think it's very, very interesting from that perspective. So you started this research from the idea of how they should take leadership as well. And then how did you come into this idea of collaboration and, how did you come to that part finally?
In fact, I worked on the paper really from this perspective of how to display leadership when you are in a matrix. And I started to work on it. And then at the same time, I was thinking, what is the outlet where I would like to have my paper published? So I have published quite a number of papers in industrial marketing management, which is in some way my natural outlet because it's the base ranked publication in B2B. But this time I wanted to move a bit out of IMM and move towards other types of publications. So I looked into the publications that were dealing with leadership and international leadership, at the same time, global leadership. And I bumped into, for instance, Leadership Quarterly, and I went to see one of my colleagues who was specialized in leadership, and they said, no, this one is not for you because it's really focused on leadership, and you are in an hybrid approach, global management and leadership. And finally, I bumped into the Journal of World Business, and I thought that's really the place where I could publish. And when I had targeted Journal of World Business, they just released a call for paper on lateral collaboration and boundary spanning approach. And this is, and this is how I integrated, because I was really, it was a draft. My paper was just a draft. So I integrated those two concepts that were already in my line of thinking, of course, but I had not focused on that. And I decided to display it more. This concept of lateral collaboration really echoes the matrix organization, and the boundary spanning role is the definition of a global account manager.
But for the audience who are not necessarily academics, because we use the term boundary spanning so much, could you explain what boundary spanning is?
To me, that's also my very personal definition for having this role, is you are always in two worlds. You are within your own company, and you are within the customer company. So you need to align the people, both organizations, towards the same objective. So boundary spanning is you're always at the boundary between your own company and the customer. You are the boundary of the team you work with, because you are working with them. You're supposed to be their boss, but you're not officially their boss. So you are also at this boundary of the organization. So you're always between two worlds.
Absolutely. In fact, in some, if you're looking at global account managers, it could even be three worlds, right? You have your customer, you have your country organization, and your organization, because I think that it's even four, right? You can think about the customer, you can think about your country organization, your organization, and other departments as well. So I think it's very interesting from the viewpoint of how you try and take a look at boundary spanning, rather than the very traditional definition of boundary spanning as between I work for my company and there's a customer on the other side and I have a foot in both. I think it's wonderful. What do you mean by lateral collaboration? Is it across peers? Or I mean, peers could be across national account managers? Or are you talking about also different functionalities as well?
I think it goes in many ways, in fact, because yes, you have this horizontal organization where the key account manager, the local key account manager, somewhere they are your peers because they also work in this key account approach. You have also their bosses, and very often they are at the same hierarchical level than you are the global account manager. But they have different objectives because they are targeting what's happening in China or what's happening in Germany. And although it's not lateral, I also include your own boss, because you have to align them with what you are doing with your customer. So in some way, it's a lateral approach. They are your boss. Of course, they are within a vertical organization, but at the same time, when I go with my boss to visit the customer, we are at the same level because we want to convince them to work on some co-creation and so on. So again, I stretch the true meaning of lateral and I move it into different directions.
So when you started working on this, so how did you go about doing this research?
Excuse me, again.
You go about, so you wanted to study lateral collaboration, you wanted to understand boundary spanning, and you know that this was very critical from the viewpoint of global leadership displayed by global managers. So once you had this idea, how did you go about executing it? How did you go about?
Okay. Okay, so the key word still was leadership, because I realized that I couldn't go to practitioners and talk about lateral collaboration or boundary spanning. Most of them do not know those words. And I tend to work from a very specific method, which has been developed by somebody called Romelaer, who is a professor at Dauphine. And I do not have any questionnaire. I have some themes I want to be discussed, but But I start with a very open way. And I started by asking the global account managers, what is leadership? I put the word leadership on the table and I said, what is your definition? How do you display leadership? What are the hurdles you encounter? Tell me your story. I induce them to move into some storytelling about leadership. And I let them to talk. And I try not to talk myself.
Indeed. So essentially, you're doing the same things like a salesperson does, right? Isn't that what we say? That as a salesperson, we let the customer talk, and we do. So it's great. So you began with leadership. So essentially, what you're saying is that once you began with leadership, once your participants started to answer, then based on how they answered, you would then start trying to mold them into saying, okay, tell us a little bit more about how do you collaborate with other people.
Yes.
Right? Am I understanding it correct in that way?
Yes. Yes, I had some themes, of course, I wanted to tackle.
Yeah.
So I had no questionnaire, but I had a list of themes I wanted them to tackle. So sometimes I would say, okay, please stop here and give me some more details, how you're doing this, or explain to me the hurdle. You said it was difficult. Why was it difficult? How was it difficult? So I really pushed them to go into more details. And I had in mind this concept, of course, of lateral collaboration, of the empowerment they could get from the customer or not. So I had a series of themes, and I was leading them to talk more about those themes.
So, which is, so if you think about when you were talking, you began with leadership, what were some of the themes that you had going in? Because the beauty of your method is that the teams can evolve as well based on what the participants tell you. But what were some of the themes that you had in mind going in to that meeting?
Okay. In fact, I chose one company, one multinational company, and I wanted to interview the global account directors, but they all belong to the same company. Because to me, it was important that they were working in the same context, within the same company methodology, to be able to show that although you work for the same company, you may display different types of leadership.
Absolutely.
So I had had an interview up front with the person who was in charge of structuring the methodology and the relationship with the different local account managers, regional account managers. So I knew the different roles of the different people, and I was just pushing them from a personal viewpoint to explain me what was the relationship with those people.
Great. So essentially, the themes are mostly around how do you interact with these people? How do you collaborate with these people?
Yes.
How do you maybe demonstrate leadership with these people? And did you also ask a lot of things about how do they adapt the way they worked?
Of course.
Yeah. So
yes, there was, of course, the cultural issue. So the question was, do you adapt? How do you adapt when you work with Chinese people or American people? But it was also interesting because they all came from international backgrounds. So they were not all French, although the multinational was French. I would say half of them were French and half of them were Germans, Americans, Dutch. So I had different nationalities. So for those who were not French, I had this also additional question: how did you adapt to the culture of this company, which is so typically French? What were the hurdles? So I also adapted my question to the nationality and the culture of the global account manager.
So great. So now that you've done this, could you share with us some of the insights that you got from your research, please?
So the first thing was that finally, because those people were very experienced, they all had a previous experience, mostly in sales or maybe directly in key account management in more junior roles. They've also had always been working in an international background. And what was interesting, for instance, was the fact that they they left out the cultural aspect.
Mhm.
And they moved to a more emotional aspect.
Mhm.
I try to be very close to my team. I try to celebrate the birthdays. I try to cook when I know a child is taking an exam and things like that. So it was very interesting to see that finally almost none of them were referring to it's difficult when you're French to work with somebody who's Indian. No, not at all. They were all saying, I master that. I master those cultural differences. I try more to be on the closeness, intimacy aspect of the relationship because my leadership finally is displayed because people enjoy working with me, because people do appreciate the person that I am.
Yeah.
That was a very interesting point in the research.
To what extent, Sylvie, do you think that when you're working for a global organization and that role, maybe it's not about the local culture, so it's the company culture that dominates. So, for example, yes, I might be a Dutch person working in a French company. I might be an Indian global account manager working there. But once I come in, yes, you go past this idea, but then the organizational culture kicks in.
Yeah.
And that is the predominant culture that dominates. And do you think that was something that you also experienced and you found in your research?
Yes, absolutely. It's the company culture, and beyond the culture, it's the company organization. They were all looking how to best fit the organization, and they were bumping into many others. For instance, they couldn't use one tool to communicate with their teams because some people belong to a branch and they did not have the authorization to use the CRM system, for instance. So how they overturned all those hurdles to adapt to the organization of the company and the specific aspects of this organization. And for a lot of them, for instance, they would say, okay, I've got the CRM, but I rather work with WhatsApp.
Yeah.
It really surprised me first.
Absolutely, indeed. This is, but that's the next thing which I wanted to ask you as well, is that because you interviewed global account directors or global account managers, whatever their title is, right? But each one of them is taking care of a different customer. So while I might still be part of the global account team, one set of customers I'm going to be dealing with would be a German customer who is demanding in a different kind of way. Another kind, my question here is that from a global account organization's perspective, how challenging can this be? Because yes, your global account directors are going to kind of adapt according to the customer, but the team that supports the global account managers now have to deal with a ultra high demanding technical customer. You could have an ultra high demanding service driven customer. So you see, the fact is that you're going to have the support teams supporting the global directors. If they don't understand that the global account leaders are playing that delicate act because they have to balance the needs of the customers, and the customers are not the same. So did you find anything along those lines? That is, how did the people who support the global account leaders cope with things?
Yes, but it's not. We are in a high-tech company. They sell the same products or the same equipments to all customers. So the demands can be slightly different, but the level of technology is about the same for all customers. What is more interesting is how, and this is what I found out, this is part of my results, and I had an intuition from the beginning that the organization of the customer would be as important as the organization of the supplier. So it's not so much about the demand of the equipment, the services that were sold, but it was more about the organization of the customer himself. Because in some cases, The global account director is really empowered by the customer.
Yeah.
And in some cases, it is not empowered by the customer. So part of the leadership depends on the relationship between the global account director and the customer at the central level.
It's very, very, very interesting. Because when you try and take a look at this, if you looked at the idea of all these different global account directors that you talk to, were all of them seen as equally important? Because some global accounts could be more important than the others, right? You could have we could have one global account that would give you 30, 40 million euros, dollars, whatever is the currency in business. And the other global account, the way you define a global account might not be there yet. So from that viewpoint, did you also see differences in how the really big global account managers saying that, you know what, I bring in more amount of money into the company? Was that also something that was there, or that was not something that came into the way they all work together?
It did not come into the discussion because we're talking about 20 global customers and they're all very large multinational companies.
Okay.
So they are in different sectors, in different industries, but this I did not feel out of our discussion.
Fantastic. So what are some of the other results? I know that I took you off on a tangent, but maybe you have other results that you think were very interesting as well.
Well, the objective, because there was an objective in this research, which was to define a typology of leadership. I wanted to show that there were different types of leadership, and I wanted to find out the criteria behind it. Not just the personality of the global account director, but as I said before, one of the criteria was the organization of the customer. Whether the customer is very centralized or your customer is decentralized, of course, the way you display your leadership is very different. In one case, you recognize as the global account director because you have some information from the head office of the customer. You are the first one to provide the information to all your team. When the customer is very decentralized, leadership is displayed between the different members. And this is where we can really talk about lateral collaboration. It's a more collective type of leadership because it can be the local account manager in China who will lead this regional project, and the regional project will be extremely important. So the global account director will come more as a support, but will not have this pivotal role that a global account director with a very centralized customer have.
And that's very, very, very interesting, because I remember once when I was doing some work with a multinational, they would classify their customers as centralized and decentralized. And when you took a look at decentralized, it came with its own set of challenges, because at the end of the day, decisions were made by the customers more locally, and essentially you would have a local sponsor and you would have to win the battle there. And it's very interesting. I've never thought about it from a leadership perspective of what if there is going to be a global account leadership. In fact, I would even say that if your customer is so decentralized, maybe you should be looking at it from the viewpoint of national account managers or even regional account managers rather than global account managers. Because that would make it a lot more, because the moment you put it into a global account organization, suddenly it has a different dynamic in terms of how do you compensate a global account manager in this kind of situation. And you will also have questions regarding AKAM and national account manager. Because you're part of a global team, you might be taking care of 2 or 3 different customers as well, whereas the global account is only taking care of one. So when that happens, you're going to have this issue of how does money, or how does the person, or the center of the cost, how is it covered when you look at centralized versus decentralized? And I think it's very, very interesting in terms of how they organize. But I love this idea of leadership being even different in terms of that. I think it's great. And what kind of advice did you provide in your research for all the global account managers or the global account directors, sales directors who would actually read your work?
Well, what was interesting is once I had finished drafting the paper, and I went back to my respondents to show them my typology at the end of leadership. And it was very interesting because the first thing they said was that we cannot be categorized in one type of leadership. We need to move from one quadrant to the other. So I showed them a matrix, and it was very interesting because they said we have to be careful that sometimes we need to be in this quadrant, but sometimes with the same customer, we need to be in this other quadrant.
Yeah.
And I think it helped them to realize how they should display agility even in leadership. And it helped them to see the criteria that were important to help them to move from one type of leadership to the other.
I think what you're saying is very interesting. Even if I want to extend it, that's what I'm thinking. Maybe you already found it in your research. I would even think the way I kind of engage with my leadership style is also going to be different depending upon if I'm talking to my boss, if I'm talking to my counterparts, if I'm talking to a customer. And again, the whole idea of agility makes it even more complex in how you deal with it. And I think that for me is a very, very interesting takeaway in terms of how you would not just have one typology because you're dealing with different stakeholders, but you're also dealing with stakeholders within the customer, within the company, and with each one of them, leadership could be how you, it's almost like you're like a chameleon, right? You're like, you have to, as in terms of how you try and take a look at this as well. But one of my last questions from my side before I would just give the floor to you to see what you might want to have as final words is this. There's this idea in leadership of something called servant leadership, right? The idea is that the leader has to be like a servant to the people right now, right? There was a time when you would have to be a transformational leader or a transactional leader or a laissez-faire or management by objectives leader kind of stuff. And now there's this whole talk about servant leadership and everything else. Did you find that, yes, they have to be displaying different kinds of leadership, but underlying, is there one aspect of that which has to be constant no matter what? You know what I mean? So is there something that you could say, or that you could maybe say from your experience, both as a professional before, as well as a researcher, from your research? What do you think?
I think what was interesting in the research is that we've moved this leadership approach from this traditional approach, transactional and transformational. I think the key here is more about the verticality of leadership, which can be what you said, the transformational leader, to the collective leadership. Yeah. And there is a new stream of leadership, which is called shared leadership, collective leadership, all types of names and slightly different approaches. I focus more on shared leadership. And the idea, and we can relate it to servant leadership, is that sometimes you have to be the boss. Sometimes you have to be in a vertical approach. And maybe you have to say, this is what the customer wants. And we all have to do that. And then you provide the vision, you provide the motivation of the customer, and we can relate it to what I call the vertical leadership. I'm the boss, and please follow me. And sometimes you have to say, okay, I'm no longer the boss, I'm no longer in charge, because we have this major project that will happen here, and I transfer my leadership to you. This is a shared leadership, but in 6 months' time, I will take back the leadership. So the key issue here is more, when do I need to really display leadership? When do I need to step back and let some members of my team display leadership? So we could say sometimes it's servant leadership, but sometimes no, you have to be
Yes.
at the forefront of the stage and say, I'm the boss, I'm the one who decides.
Fantastic. So what would be, in the interest of time, what would be your advice to those global account managers who are watching this podcast?
I think the advice is really to bring their teams together,
Yeah.
and be really on an active listening mode to decide when you should give this leadership to your team, when you should keep the leadership. It's more working on this hybrid form. From time to time, I need them to take the leadership, and sometimes, or most of the time, in some cases, I will display leadership, and I have to be recognized as that leader. So I think it's more, you shouldn't want to be always the leader. It's not because you have this wonderful title, Global Account Director. Sometimes you need to let it go and let your team take the leadership, bring forward a project which is very important for your customer. And I know it's sometimes difficult. You take the light, you are on the front stage, and sometimes you need to step back. It's sometimes a bit difficult, but I think the most successful global account directors are those who are capable of this type of agility.
Well, thank you so much for that explanation. And I'm sure that you're also doing a lot of more interesting research in the world of key account managers and global account managers. And again, I'm hoping that the people who actually seeing this podcast are actually getting some nice ideas and can reach out to you as well. Thank you so much, Professor Lacoste, for taking the time. And for the audience, stay tuned for more of these.